Well, thank you so much for everyone coming today, and I must thank our event organisers and the partners of this event for having me here and for elevating the conversation around youth employment and entrepreneurship. I must say I'm so glad I got to see that presentation from our partners, this bank, the local bank here. That's incredible work, and it's really encouraging to see the private sector taking a lead, and not just in the region, but for the entire world, to invest in entrepreneurship and to invest in innovation. It's absolutely critical, and it's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, I must say it's a really large room, and I'm going to run a little experiment here. There's a huge problem in the world. This picture is depicting part of it. There is a global youth employment crisis, or youth unemployment crisis, in the world right now. There's 1.8 billion youth in the world. 87% of them live in developing countries. And 2/3 of those, so about just over 1 billion youth, are not in full-time education and employment right now. Now, in Australia, in one of the most robust economies in the world, we're not immune from this problem. 1 in 4 youth between the ages of 15 to 24 are not in full-time education and employment. But interestingly, the stats as you go around Europe, and I'm here in Turkey, so let's talk about some of the statistics here in Turkey. They're pretty bad. So I want to run a little experiment. Can everyone in the room put up their hand right now if they're between the ages of 15 and 29? Can everyone raise their hand? Who's 15 and 29 in the room right now? A lot of people. So leave your hand up. Leave your hand up, leave your hand up, because this speech is for you guys, right? The work that I do is for you. Everyone that's not got their hand up, can you look around the room right now and see how many people there are? This is the future of your business. This is the future of your economy. This is the future of your innovation. These are the guys that are going to carry the world forwards. In Turkey right now, in January, the youth unemployment rate was about 15%. It's just gone up, 16.4%. It's just gone up to 19%. Now everyone, I know I'm keeping your hands up, but keep them up. I want everyone else in the room to be looking at how many people there are in the room right now. 35% of the people with their hand up right now, if you guys are representative of the Turkish population, 35% of you guys aren't in full-time education, employment or training. So you look around the room, 1 in 3 people with their hand up aren't getting trained, they're not in a job, and they probably are a little bit worried about what their future looks like. If you look at the women, it's 1 in 2. 50% of the people with their hand up right now aren't in full-time education or employment. If you look at the men, it's 1 in 5, 20%. All right, you can put your hands down. Thank you for doing that experiment. I want to illustrate that not just for you guys are living this problem, so I don't need to talk about it to you guys, but it's so important for everyone else in the room that aren't experiencing this for themselves, that grew up in a different generation, to see the potential impact that this has on the economy. We talk about this at the G20. I represent Australia for the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance, and we hosted the G20 this year, which is, I'm sure, part of the reason that I've been granted the opportunity to come and talk to you guys. And we really amplified this message, and I want to really encourage everyone here, get on Twitter. The media is a democracy these days, so it's not just those that have the power to write media that can publish articles in traditional media, but everyone here can be, you are the creators of your own media here. So if you hear something that you like, a quote of mine, a picture, take photos. If there's anyone that you know that's here that isn't in the room right now, text them and get them in the room, because this session's for you guys. We need to amplify the importance of this problem. The global youth employment crisis is, in my view and in many other people's view around the world, equally as important as the global financial crisis of 2008. The problem is that we're not going to fall off a cliff in the next 12 months if we don't address this. It's systemic, and it's going to have implications for 10, 20, 30 years, multiple generations to come if we don't address it. So unfortunately, it's not getting the level of importance in really high political forums that it should. Thankfully this year, during the G20 in Australia, despite the fact that the Leaders' Declaration in St. Petersburg was over 120 recommendations on 27 pages, and it was reduced down to 21 recommendations on 3 pages for the Brisbane communique. Despite how difficult it was to get important issues into that document, we got there. We got in within the first 10 recommendations, youth unemployment and education and training, and most importantly, entrepreneurship as a solution into the Leaders' Declaration. Now, that's really important, but we're not done yet. This year is Turkey's, in 2015, Turkey hosted G20, and I'll talk about this in a little bit further. But we need to keep amplifying this message, and it's everyone in the room that can do that. One of my favorite quotes is from Mahatma Gandhi: "You must be the change you want to see in the world." It's up to you guys to do this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking. Now, we're at the Innovation Festival, so I have a rhetorical question which I'll leave you to ponder is, what is innovation without commercialization? And part of the answer to that is around entrepreneurship. So let's talk about what entrepreneurship is. It starts with identifying a problem. The great entrepreneurs in the world solve really big problems. That was a fantastic point from Nicolas, the previous speaker, around the new brain drain, that there's not enough people solving really big problems in the world. Great entrepreneurs do that. They pick big problems and they create world-changing solutions. So the process of entrepreneurship starts with identifying a problem. You need to create a sustainable commercial solution, and sustainable in this context is something that will survive, that will keep going. You then need to identify who values that solution, so you need to figure out who your target market is, and you have to take action, the most critical part of the process, which entrepreneurs are so good at. So this is a process. What happens with this process, as you go through it, you learn 7 mindsets, but simultaneously, you might already have some of these mindsets, and they can drive you to be better at that process. So that is being passionate, inspired, and energetic, empowered and confident enough to take opportunities, having an ownership mentality, being a fast decision maker and taking risks, leadership, being disciplined and hardworking, and constantly learning and adapting and being dynamic. This concept has already been changing the world for hundreds of years. But in this context of this global youth employment crisis, this is the solution. And it's ecosystems, much like some that were just talked about, it's ecosystems that support this process that will solve the global youth employment crisis. So what is an ecosystem? We heard some of the elements, some of the pillars explained in the last talk. But what is an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship? So let's use a rainforest as an analogy. In a rainforest, arguably one of the most efficient ecosystems, the trees are dense, they're strong, they're tall. So think about the businesses in an ecosystem or in an economy are like the trees. So you start a business with an idea, and you must plant that idea in innovation and technology. The idea must be innovative. You have to be doing something new, something different. If you can create an innovative and ideally technology-enabled idea, that doesn't necessarily mean a tech business, but a technology-enabled business, then you're far more likely to succeed, and this is the first pillar of creating a stronger ecosystem. And I'll go into some recommendations that the G20 make for each of these pillars later in the talk. The second pillar is access to investment and finance. So you take your idea, you take your seed, you plant it, you make it innovative, and then you need to water it with access to finance so it will grow faster. Next, you need education and support, like the sun in this analogy. It doesn't matter how innovative an idea is and how much money you throw at it. If you don't know what you're doing, if the entrepreneurs aren't educated to be more efficient and better and learn from best practice, then they will fail. The next pillar in this ecosystem is the government, and I use deliberately simple slides here to illustrate that this isn't a super complex concept. The government are kind of like the animals or the critters in an ecosystem. They can be very facilitative and create a stronger ecosystem. They can also be very destructive. We talk about an honest and responsive government. You need legislation in order to facilitate better businesses and stronger ecosystems. The next pillar is the entrepreneurship culture. This is like the atmosphere in an ecosystem. Difficult to pinpoint exactly what causes it or what creates it, but it's a combination of all the pillars. It's what the media say, it's what the parents tell you when you're growing up, it's what your teachers say in schools to their students, it's what government leaders say in the media, and are they encouraging entrepreneurship? It's quite an ethereal concept, but critical. And the last pillar is trade and globalization. This is like the wind in an analogy. This is what takes businesses and grows them out and brings in new innovation and new ideas. It's trade that creates net growth in an economy. So now I'm going to illustrate these two concepts. I'd like to tell you and share with you a little story about a bit of a screw-up young Australian that discovered some of these concepts. I've been running businesses since I was about 19, but I'll tell you how I got there. So when I was at university, I went to university, I started studying a Bachelor of Psychology. And I studied that because I really love to help people. I love learning about how people think, but most importantly, I just wanted to help people. Now, I did psychology for about 1.5 years, and then I discovered nightclubs. And I thought, wow, they're way more fun. So I went and spent a lot of time there, and not a whole lot of time at university, and very quickly dropped out and got myself into all sorts of psychological problems and ended up in front of a psychopharmacologist. There's a mouthful for the translator. A psychopharmacologist called John, Dr. John. And he turned my life around. But then he got diagnosed with bone cancer, which had metastasized through his entire body, and he was given 4 months to live. And he kept seeing his patients until a month before he died. And he sat me down a month before he died, the last time I ever saw him, and he said to me, Jeremy, if you can get to the end of your life and look back and honestly tell yourself that you've made every step count, you'll die a happy man. This obviously was profound to me and completely changed the course of my life. And I can still to this day vividly remember walking out of his office. I don't know if you can see my feet from there. Walking out of his office, and I was looking at my feet, I can still see this, and I was just walking back to the train station, but I'm like, you know what? Every single one of these steps has to count from now on. And since then, I've done my best to make sure everyone has. But I was a 19-year-old kid with absolutely no idea what I was doing. So I'm like, I've got this new philosophy on life. I want to make every step count, but how do I do that? So I used to love helping people from the psychology degree. I'm sure you guys have them here. There's people in Sydney on the streets and in a lot of places in the world with little clipboards, right? And they come up to you and they're like, hey, do you want to save these kids in Africa? Give us your credit card details. I'd be like, yep, great, sign me up. And then there'd be I'd pass another one down the street, and do you want to save some dolphins off the coast of South Africa or something? I'd be like, great, yep, I've got to make a difference in the world, sign me up. Very quickly, as a 19-year-old kid working in hospitality, my bank balance got to about that. And my mum sat me down, and she's like, Jeremy, if you want to make a difference in the world, you kind of need to be able to eat. Again, a fairly profound moment. It's like, yeah, right, I kind of need to look after my own finances before I'm going to be able to have a large impact on the world. At the same time, I was running around telling people this philosophy, and I met a guy, and he gave me a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Has anyone read Rich Dad, Poor Dad? Anyone in the audience? A couple of people? If not, I highly recommend you go and get it. It's a story about a young boy, and he has a poor dad who works for a salary, and a relatively okay salary, but he's capped for his whole life, spends all his disposable income, doesn't end up particularly wealthy. He has a rich dad who starts companies and builds them and sells them and then ends up very rich. Now, what this taught me was, wow, here's this concept called entrepreneurship. I didn't even really understand what entrepreneurship meant when I was at school. We weren't taught this stuff. But here's this concept, and I'm like, wow, bing, light bulb. I need to create companies that will generate enough wealth to have a massive impact on the world. If I want to create enough, if I want to have a really big impact, I need to build businesses that will help enable me to do that. So the entrepreneur in Jeremy was born. I wasn't the guy selling lemonade at 11 years old on the street. I realized that it was something that I wanted to do because it would help me make every step count. So at the time, my brother was opening up a juice bar in Sydney. That's it, a little juice bar. And he said, hey, why don't you go and study business at university, and I'll let you manage this. So he opened it up. I managed it. And from the day we opened the doors, it was in one of the best locations in Sydney, in Australia, actually. So it was about a $1.2 million business. So it went really well. We opened up 2 more. And one of them went horribly. One of them went pretty good. But care of the fact that we were pretty good at this, I got asked to go over to Singapore at 21 years old and run the master franchise. Now, while I was there, one of my school friends, Andrew McIver, walked into my office. He'd heard I was there, and he had an idea, because at this point I was an employee, really. I was running businesses, I was learning about it, but I wasn't really an entrepreneur. Now, Andrew walks into my office, and he says, hey, I still remember this as well. He says, hey, Jeremy, I've come across these berries in the Amazon in Brazil. They're called acai. We should be selling these through juice bars. I've been to Venice Beach in Los Angeles, and they're doing really well. They have this frozen puree, they blend it up into a bowl, and it's delicious. And I'm like, you're crazy. I can't even pronounce this word. How are we going to sell this to juice bars in Australia? Now, my first reaction was, wow, that's risky. I've got a good salary. Why would I leave a good job to go back and risk starting my own company? But I did a little bit more research into the acai industry, and it turns out it operates on this people, planet, and profit, these triple bottom line principle. It's good for the people where it comes from because it operates on fair trade principles. Everyone gets a fair share of the revenue and the margin. It's good for the planet because it grows wild, and it's actually Greenpeace endorsed because it grows wild. The local people go out into the wild and harvest it, and then they sell it on the free market. And because it grows wild, they don't want these trees to be chopped down, so they learn about sustainability, and they actually protect the Amazon because they want to sustain themselves. So that by growing the acai industry, we actually grew education around sustainability. So people, planet, and profit. Of course, for a business to be sustainable, you have to be able to make a profit. What you do with that profit, whether you're a not-for-profit and you give it back, or you pay it in salaries, or you're a for-profit and you pay a little bit out to shareholders, if you're having a positive impact and solving a big problem that's good for humanity, which we believe we were by building this business, then it's a good business. So he convinced me, and we started this company called Rio Life. And this was 9 years ago now, and it went on and won Australia's fastest growing small business and did some really cool stuff. But the coolest thing about this business was these guys. We kept 1% of our revenue, and we ran a school in the Amazon, and we put 100 children through school just with the 1% of our revenue for 2 years. And this school is still going, and we still contribute to it. So about 10 or 11 years after I'd originally wanted to create a business that can do good things in the world, I finally figured out how to do it. I built a business, and I could put kids through school by using my business. Now, how cool is that? And that hands down, is the best experience I've ever had. Even in the years since, traveling the world and speaking to world leaders, that's the coolest thing. And now what I get to do is try and help a whole bunch of other people do similar things. So I did Rio Life for 7.5 years. I was CEO, And I wanted to help more people. So I started mentoring some businesses, I started speaking and teaching, and I left as CEO. I started working on a book because I was searching for a more leveraged impact. I was like, okay, I can help 100 kids, but maybe I can help 100 businesses and they all help 100 kids, and then all of a sudden we're helping 10,000 children. So I wrote a book and published it about 2.5 years ago. And I wanted that to help more young people start companies, but most importantly, learn to start companies that solve real problems. And then, as I was publishing that book, I got asked to take a delegation of young Australians over to Mexico. This was 2.5 years ago. And, I had about 3 weeks to organize the delegation, but that's another story. Because I discovered this thing called the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance. Now, this was set up 5 years ago to advocate on behalf of the world's young entrepreneurs, the future business leaders, the innovators, and the guys that are going to create the businesses and the new ideas of the future, to the G20 leaders. So the G20 leaders, the leader of Turkey is there as well, of course, and you guys are hosting the G20, as I mentioned. But the G20 leaders 5 years ago weren't talking about entrepreneurship. They were talking about the global financial crisis, they were talking about financial market regulation and all the complicated macroeconomic stuff. They weren't talking about what needs to be done to create jobs for youth and the fact that youth can be job creators themselves. So that's why the G20 was set up. And we got to host this last year. So I'm just going to play for you now a little video about our summit.
Global unemployment is spiraling out of control, creating an impending crisis that unfairly impacts our youth. During the global financial crisis, the world's youth unemployment rate hit record high levels. According to the International Labour Organization, 73.4 million young workers were unemployed in 2013. There is a youth bulge of 1.8 billion. 90% of them live in developing countries, and 2/3 of those are underemployed. Even in Australia, one of the most robust economies in the world, 1 in 4 youths are currently not in full-time education or employment. The youth employment crisis has serious social, economic, political, and systemic implications that the world's leaders in government, business, civil society, and especially youth all agree on. Entrepreneurship is the solution. Young entrepreneurs create sustainable growth and jobs, and entrepreneurship ecosystems lift societies out of poverty to create a better world. The G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance is an organization that fosters youth entrepreneurship at the highest economic and political level globally. We are responding to the call to adopt immediate and specific actions to tackle the unprecedented youth employment crisis. Since 2009, G20 YEA has organized international summits and meetings with high impact in 9 countries. World leaders like former Mexican President Calderón, top entrepreneurs and organizations like Ernst & Young and Accenture, and personalities like Mohammed Yunus have joined with the Alliance to ensure sustainable job creation and growth. In Russia, the G20 and B20 leaders agreed in their official declaration that youth entrepreneurship is a solution for unemployment. Now, we must keep them accountable and create tangible actions. If you are seeking to impact the future of our youth and the world, then you can't miss this incredible opportunity to support and partner with the G20 YEA. Our effort continues on July 18th to 22nd in Sydney, Australia, at the 5th Annual G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance Summit. Our main goals are to create an action plan on youth employment, leverage our new partnerships with the United Nations Development Programme and the UN Millennium Campaign, to create a major goal on youth employment and entrepreneurship in the post-2015 UN Development Agenda, as well as influence world leaders to shape high-impact global policies and programs in support of entrepreneurship. Join us and help change the world. Apply now to get involved and partner at www.g20yeasummit.com.
Get an applause. Great, thank you. So before I go into the UN, I mentioned that we succeeded in getting the youth unemployment and entrepreneurship into the Leaders' Declaration, the Brisbane Leaders' Declaration. Entrepreneurship actually is in there twice, once for youth unemployment and once connected to innovation in the area of trade. Now that's good, it's not good enough. It needs to be amplified more. I meant what I said before. The global youth employment crisis really needs to be addressed with the same level of urgency as the global financial crisis. Because the future there's this concept called scarring, right? The future loss of wages and productivity and growth based on the youth that are not in education, employment or training right now is massive, and it's getting worse. In our country in the last quarter, unemployment, general unemployment went down by 0.5%, youth unemployment went up. Now what's going on there? Even though we're still talking, even though we're getting the G20 leaders to acknowledge it, we're not fixing it. So as part of the journey with the G20 YEA over the last 2.5 years, I was introduced to the United Nations in New York about 1.5 years ago. And we signed an agreement with them to work together on getting youth employment and entrepreneurship as a major goal in the Sustainable Development Agenda, so the post-2015 agenda. Now, why is that important? So, first of all, the G20 leaders might agree that youth unemployment's a problem, and hopefully they can convince their governments in their countries to implement the employment plan that was agreed, and I hope that entrepreneurship is part of the solution there. But we don't know yet. The employment plans were only just created, and youth unemployment is really only just being elevated to that level of discussion. So we have a unique opportunity right now where over the next 12 months or so, leading up to the General Assembly in New York next year, the entire world's leaders will determine on what the development goals should be for the next 15 years. So back in 2000, Kofi Annan got the entire world's leaders to agree on these 8 major goals with 21 indicators, one of which, for an example, was eradicating or halving extreme poverty and hunger, so halving the amount of people living on less than $1.25 per day, and they've achieved that. Now, what these goals did was align and focus the world's governments, development organizations, NGOs, all of the people working in development on some specific goals. And it's worked pretty well. I think just over half of these of the 21 indicators have been achieved, not all of them, but what has been achieved is phenomenal. Now, between 2015 and 2030, there'll be a new set of goals that will influence around $2.5 trillion worth of development investment. Is that enough? Arguably no. However, it's still a pretty significant amount of money. So what we can do by getting youth employment and entrepreneurship elevated up into these goals is have every single leader in the world agree that this is a problem and have the goals guide the investment in development for the entire world, this huge amount of money invested in employment and entrepreneurship, particularly for youth. Now, this is all pretty high-level stuff, you know, talking to the G20 leaders, talking to the United Nations. So I want to give you an example of why it's important and how it trickles down to the grassroots. So here is, on the left is a lady called Mary Ann, on the right is Mary Grace. Now, Mary Ann on the left has 3 children, and to survive, she builds wicker baskets and sells them. Now, she was introduced to this concept called microfinance and was educated about financial literacy, so access to capital and education, 2 of the pillars. And now she borrows $100 every 6 months so that she can buy all of her basket ingredients in bulk. Now, what that does is that means that she saves money. She actually is able to make an extra $1.50 or so a day out of her baskets. And with that $1.50 a day, she puts her kids through school. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to afford it. So you can see that a very high-level concept around access to capital, some education, and you put kids through school. One of the Millennium Development Goals was around universal access to education. So an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship actually starts to address a lot of the Millennium Development Goals that aren't specifically related to employment. But by definition, if you can help people become personally financially sustainable, then you address poverty. So it's not rocket science. You just need to help people to make money for themselves. So Mary Ann learned how to do that. Mary Grace on the right did a similar thing, but now she teaches this concept. She travels around the Philippines and teaches financial literacy and microfinance and entrepreneurship. And there's 10,000 women like her that do that, funded by an organization that has been influenced by the Millennium Development Goals. So by catalyzing this investment and becoming a beacon for what the world should invest in to further development, the development goals are incredibly important. So this concept, I hope now you can see how and why it's important. I want to touch really quickly on some of these mindsets because it's not just about starting companies. Learning this process by experience, by doing, actually shifts the way people think. And this is potentially very difficult to measure. I'm sure someone will soon. But this is potentially has an even greater impact on society than just the economic outcomes of creating jobs and creating growth. This can actually create more engaged citizens, people that do more for society, that become better employees, that are better leaders, that have an ownership mentality rather than being victims. So some quotes really quickly to illustrate what these mindsets really mean. Confucius said, "Choose a job that you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life." If you ever come across an entrepreneur, and I'm sure that if you come and talk to me after this, you'll understand, we're pretty passionate about what we do, and we like to do what we love. There was a study that came out by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor back in 2013 entitled, "Entrepreneurs are the happiest people on the planet." I'd like to say I'm pretty happy most of the time because I get to do what I love. Now, being empowered and confident enough to take opportunities. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Now, it would be naive to say that there's no such thing as luck. Obviously, some people have more opportunities than other people, but it's those that seize the opportunity that are the lucky ones. An ownership mentality. Peter Drucker said the best way to predict the future is to create it. You can create what you want in the world. It's not going to be handed to you or gifted to you. It's up to you to get out there and create it. Fast decision-making and risk-taking. So T.S. Eliot said, "Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go." Now, this is from a mindset perspective, and what I'm talking about here is learning these mindsets beyond starting companies. From a mindset perspective, learning to take risks and being okay with failure has a huge positive impact on people's mentality and what society can do. You know, by the last speaker, Nicolas, previous, said around innovation being about breaking the rules, doing something different. You need to be willing to take risks and fail. So John C. Maxwell said, with regards to leadership, that it's taking responsibility whilst others are making excuses. Being disciplined and hardworking. Entrepreneurship's not easy. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do. It teaches you to be disciplined and hardworking. Thomas Edison, one of the most prolific innovators of our time, said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So the guy that you would think is the smartest, the guy that just happens to come up with stuff, he's telling us that it's not about the idea, it's about the execution. It's about working hard. That's how you become an innovator, and that's how you become one of the people that has a positive impact on society. Being learning, adaptive, and dynamic, our final mindset. And the great man Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. You must constantly be learning, not just as an entrepreneur in life. So, I have 11 minutes. I'm going to speed through the rest of this presentation so we're not too far off track. So what are the recommendations that the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance gave to the G20 leaders relevant to each pillar of this ecosystem? So in innovation technology, our recommendation was for government to incentivize commercialization programs. So there's some really great programs out there that help take research and development out of the institutions, commercialize it, and turn it into products and services. One of the best things that governments can do is to facilitate more of that, because there's loads of research and development. In access to investment and finance, an example of what our banking partner is doing here is a fantastic example of this. Easier access to loans and innovative new formats of financing like equity crowdfunding. And interestingly, this is something that's a big topic for for Turkey's hosting of the G20. In education and support, our recommendation was around closing the link and creating more cooperation between the private sector and education institutions. We have this huge skills gap. Turkey's doing some amazing things with regards to the level of people in education, but education's not enough, because there's so many overeducated children or youth leaving school, leaving secondary or tertiary education and still not being able to find a job. So business has to engage in the development of curriculum, and vice versa. Universities or schools need to reach out to business to learn what do we need to do to change the way that we're teaching so that the people that come out of our institutions are ready for a job. Now, I have a pretty radical idea on this, which I've been voicing privately to a lot of people. I'm going to run a little experiment here and see if everyone picks up on it and agrees with me. It's potentially a revolutionary idea. I think Nicolas's idea around free access to internet is far more revolutionary, and that should definitely be adopted and amplified to anyone that can help make that possible. But that won't necessarily solve the skills mismatch. This idea might, and the idea is that every university degree, every tertiary education should be delivered part-time with mandatory work experience. Everyone going through school should be given the opportunity to experience what it's going to be like applying their knowledge in real life. That could potentially solve the global skills mismatch. So let's see if that idea gains any traction in this forum. In government taxation and regulation, the G20 YEA's recommendation was to reduce the tax burden on labour. Obviously, if we're going to create jobs, taxing labour is counterproductive to that, and increasing disposable income is a fantastic way of developing a society. In culture, interestingly, the biggest impact that we decided on in culture is that experiential entrepreneurship education should be delivered through every layer of the curriculum, from primary, secondary and tertiary, all the way through. Children and youth should be learning by doing entrepreneurship. And in trade and globalization, our recommendation was to create a multilateral startup visa. So this would be a visa that enables young people that have startup companies to travel and do business outside, and also to relax the immigration laws so that when you have a high-growth company, you can get skilled labour if it's not in your country. And in places like Australia, there's a huge deficit of software engineers. So we really need more of them in our country. Now, care of Turkey being host of the G20 and your Prime Minister just announcing what the priorities are going to be, and I'm really pleased with the announcement, I must say, because it's right up a lot of our recommendations. So the three areas that the G20 and Turkey will focus on is inclusiveness, implementation, and investment for growth. Now, what I really love is inclusive development. You know, we have this opportunity around the Sustainable Development Goals, and inclusive growth means everybody, not just the rich, everybody, not just the G20 countries, the entire world. So we need to create growth for everybody with equality. And what's an undercurrent of all of the priorities that have been announced is a focus on SMEs, on small and medium enterprises, and entrepreneurship. So that's a fantastic development from our perspective. Also, the recommendations around youth unemployment are going to be carried forward as a priority. Fantastic. So I'm really excited to see what happens in 2015 under Turkey's chairmanship of the G20. There's three pillars: strengthening the global recovery and lifting the potential. So that's macro policies, the investment in infrastructure. There's enhancing resilience, which are the more financial regulation, and buttressing sustainability, which is really about development and the UN Summit on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the G20, the government has announced fantastic. I think it's a fantastic agenda. And the Business 20 is following suit. So the Business 20 is the voice of the big business leaders to the G20, arguably one of the most influential engagement groups for the G20. And they're following. So inclusiveness, continuity of previous B20 years, SMEs, and connectivity. Interestingly, connectivity is a focus for the B20. So, and they have 5 main areas. So financing growth, human capital and employment, infrastructure and investment, trade, anti-corruption, and they've created a new task force this year specifically for SMEs and entrepreneurship. Really exciting. So one of the 5 major themes of the B20 is going to be small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurship, because it's being recognised that it's the SMEs that are the engine room of growth and jobs. Now, in order to take the concept of an ecosystem a little bit further, this is some brand new research that just got released as part of Global Entrepreneurship Week last week, just from the 17th of November. So this is an index which analyses the entrepreneurship ecosystem in 130 countries right now. It takes the concept that I presented earlier, which is very basic, and expands it, so it's far more complex. This is the report for Turkey. Now, there's a lot of numbers and stuff going on that screen, so I'm just going to point you to a couple of key figures here. So Turkey's rank in the world is 25 of 130. That's pretty good. What isn't shown on that screen is that the GEI, so the Global Entrepreneurship Index, which is the actual score that's given, Turkey's one of the countries that increased the most over the past 12 months. It increased by 10. Now, if you look into the graph on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis is the Global Entrepreneurship Index. On the horizontal axis, which you can't see the words, is the GDP per capita. So basically, that's the productivity of the people in a country. And what you'll see there is Turkey, in comparison to countries of a similar GDP per capita, is actually very high. That's interesting. And that means that you're outperforming the norm for countries that have a similar level of productivity. Now, on the right-hand side, in the bottom right, you've got the 15 pillars. So the dark blue line is Turkey, and the medium line is Europe as a region, which is where Turkey is benchmarked. So what you'll see is that Turkey, on the point 12, high growth, Turkey outperforms the region. So if a business starts, it's very likely that it's going to grow very quickly. That's fantastic. What this concept allows you to do is analyze bottlenecks. So you can analyze, based on specific areas of the ecosystem, what's actually creating a constraint, as opposed to just addressing all of the pillars. So the two here that we can focus on are opportunity startup and competition. To explain what that means, opportunity startup is the amount of businesses that start by identifying an opportunity or a really big problem and then solving it, as opposed to just starting something out of necessity. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs that start because they're in poverty or they just have to create an income somehow. So that's one of the bottlenecks in Turkey, is the amount of companies that actually identify big problems and then commercialize the solution to that. The other one's competition. So competition is the amount of businesses that do something different, that innovate and do something new, as opposed to just copying someone else and creating another business that's the same. So these two factors are the two biggest bottlenecks to Turkey's entrepreneurship ecosystem right now. And if you dig into that report, it's available online. You can go and have a look at it. And if you connect to me on Twitter, I'll post all this stuff as well. Before you go and make improvements to an ecosystem, it's really important to identify what the problems are in the ecosystem first. So this is a fantastic index. Now, this is a white paper that the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance published. You'll notice that we did it in partnership with various UN agencies and Global Entrepreneurship Week and the Youth 20 as well. The major recommendation from this paper is around the major goal on youth employment and entrepreneurship, but there's been some really big learnings that came out of the research. And the really big learnings are that high-growth enterprises are the solution. So there was a study conducted on 380,000 companies in 10 countries that showed that the top 5% of companies measured by job growth create 67% of the jobs and 72% of the revenue in those economies. So those top 5% of high-growth enterprises are the ones creating all the jobs and all the revenue. So you need an ecosystem that supports high-growth enterprises. Self-employment's not the solution, but an ecosystem that supports those high-growth enterprises will also generate self-employment. So when you're analysing the ecosystem, it's about high-impact, high-growth enterprises as a focus, but the broader ecosystem will support everyone else as well. Now, what we know from the research with Ernst & Young and Accenture over the years, we've analysed thousands of entrepreneurs from the G20 countries. Access to capital is consistently one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest inhibitors. It's unilateral across all the countries. So, and we know that there's a global Series A crunch. So we need to create high-growth enterprises. They can't get the money they need when they're growing. And Series A, so an equity raise of around 500,000 to $5 million US, is really the critical point where there's a massive deficit. You can get money, if you're really good in many countries, you can get less than that. And once you start to be raising 5 million or more, then the private equity and the more established venture capital is available. However, in the middle, there's this massive gap, the Series A crunch. So, interestingly, there's not actually a lack of capital there, it's just risk averse. So there's a lack of quality deals or quality entrepreneurs. What's happening is that they're not educated, they're not good enough, or they don't have the correct documentation to get that money. So solving this problem is potentially, through access to capital and education, is potentially the highest impact solution for entrepreneurs globally. So I'm going to run you very quickly, I'm out of time, around a business model, a profitable social enterprise that we're building now to solve this problem. So it's called CapitalPitch. This is actually one of the first stages I've announced this. And we're streamlining Series A capital raising between businesses, investors, and advisors. It's basically an equity crowdfunding platform, for those of you that are aware of this. If not, you look up, it's crowdfunding for shares or equity. But it also allows a business to engage a corporate advisor. They can create a pitch, it gets advertised to an investor network, or they can engage a corporate advisor, get investor ready, and then launch a CapitalPitch certified advisor version out to investor networks. To give you an example, Rio Life, my business, we failed to raise our Series A, and that was part of the reason that I left. And instead of going massively global, we were stuck in Australia. What could have happened is we could have taken our raise to a platform like CapitalPitch, engaged an advisor, been educated on how to be investor ready, advertised out to an investor network online using technology, far more scalable. We should have been able to raise our money, and off we would have gone. We went from 1 to 10 employees in 3 years. We should have gone from 10 to 100, but instead we stagnated and we sit still at about 6 employees. Now for investors, this is a good solution. It creates a global syndicate, so you can syndicate your investment. It creates arbitrage opportunities. You can play foreign exchange. You can look for markets where the valuations on companies are lower, and it's massively de-risked because you know that people are being vetted and they're getting education. So with that, I will finish. And I'm going to finish and leave you with 2 ideas or questions that I'd like you to ponder, everyone in the room, is how are you going to make every step count? And what big problem can you solve that will change the world? You can connect me, you can send me an email, I'll reply to as many as I possibly can. You can connect me with me on Twitter. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the organisers and the partners. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Innovation Week.